History is a river that often buries its most magnificent stones beneath the currents of time. We are taught of the great European monarchs, the vast expansion of the Mughal Empire, and the colonial galleons that conquered the oceans. Yet, hidden in the blind spots of these grand narratives is a truth far more compelling, a truth about men who were stripped of their homes, their names, and their freedom, only to rewrite the destiny of the world's most powerful empires. Imagine a chessboard where kings and queens move with the arrogance of divine right, completely unaware that the hand moving them belongs to a man they once considered property. This is not a tale of submission. It is the story of shrewd African diplomats, brilliant minds born in the cradle of civilization, who found themselves in foreign lands and decided they would not be crushed by the weight of history. Instead, they became the architects of it. They looked at the encroaching Portuguese armadas and the unstoppable Mughal cavalry, and they did not tremble. They smiled. They played these leviathans against each other with such devastating cunning that European kings and Asian emperors were left grasping at shadows, looking like absolute fools. If you find yourself captivated by these hidden truths and the untold brilliance of Black history, do not let this journey end here. Leave a like to honor their memory. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more forgotten chapters of the past, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice helps us keep these eternal stories alive. The journey. Let it begin now. The soil of Eastern Africa holds the memories of 1,000 generations. Before the world knew the cold touch of global empires, the highlands of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa were flourishing centers of faith, trade, and ancient wisdom. It was a land where the air was thick with the scent of frankincense and the chanting of ancient prayers. But the wind that swept across the Red Sea began to carry a different scent, the scent of greed. The global demand for human labor and military prowess cast a long, dark shadow over these lands. Children born to be shepherds, scholars, or chiefs were suddenly thrust into a nightmare of iron and blood. They were torn from the embrace of their mothers, dragged from the familiar warmth of their hearths, and marched toward the unforgiving shores. This was not merely the theft of human bodies, it was an attempt to harvest the spirit of Africa. These captives were known as the Habshas, a name derived from al-Habash, the Arabic term for Abyss. Among them were individuals possessing a rare quiet brilliance. They were observers. As they were bound and led away from everything they knew, their eyes memorized the cruel geometry of power. They learned early that, in a world governed by violence, the mind is the only sanctuary that cannot be chained. The grief of leaving their homeland was an ocean in itself. Yet within that grief, a seed of unparalleled resilience was planted. They were being sold as commodities, but beneath the surface of their quiet submission lay a dormant, roaring fire. The men who bought them thought they were purchasing obedient tools of war and labor. They could not fathom that. They were importing the very architects of their future downfall. The ocean has a way of erasing the past. As the wooden ships tore through the dark waters of the Indian Ocean, the African captives looked back until the silhouette of their continent vanished beneath the horizon. The journey across the sea was a crucible of unimaginable agony. Crammed into the suffocating bellies of merchant vessels, they existed in the space between life and death. The rhythmic crashing of the waves became a constant reminder of their isolation. Yet, it was in this very darkness that a profound transformation began. Stripped of their tribal affiliations, their distinct languages, and their local customs, the Habshus forged a new identity born of shared survival. They communicated in the universal language of suffering and endurance. They realized that the world they were entering was a sprawling, chaotic arena of empires fighting for supremacy. The Indian Ocean trade routes were not just pathways for spices and silk. They were the veins through which the greed of the world flowed. The Portuguese had begun to assert their dominance over these waters with their devastating cannons, while Arab and Indian merchants navigated the shifting tides of commerce. The Africans aboard these ships observed it all. They watched the negotiations, the betrayals, and the fragile alliances formed between merchants and captains. They were learning the intricate dance of diplomacy from the very bottom of the human hierarchy. Every lash of the whip, every transaction at port, taught them how power was accumulated and how it could be dismantled. By the time the ships reached the humid, bustling ports of the Indian subcontinent, the terrified captives who had left the African shores were gone. In their place stood men hardened by the sea, their minds sharpened into weapons. They stepped onto the foreign soil of the Deccan Plateau, not as defeated men, but as silent scholars of human nature, ready to turn the chains of their bondage into the instruments of their supreme reign. The Indian subcontinent rose from the mist of the Arabian Sea like a sprawling mirage of unfathomable wealth and ancient labyrinthine complexities. As the weary feet of the captive Africans touched the sun-baked, unforgiving stones of the Deccan Plateau, they were immediately swallowed by an atmosphere thick with the sensory overload of a new world. The air was heavy with the sharp aroma of roasted cardamom, crushed marigolds, the metallic temps of blood from the butcher stalls, and the sweat of 1,000 different merchants pursuing the relentless religion of commerce. The markets of the Deccan were a staggering, chaotic theater of humanity, a crossroads where the wealth of the East met the insatiable hunger of the West. bales of silk from the furthest reaches of the Orient, sacks of spices that carried the value of entire naval fleets, and the finest steel blades forged in distant, legendary fires were laid out beneath the punishing glare of the Indian sun. Yet, amidst this dazzling, overwhelming display of the world's material riches, the most prized, the most expensive, and the most fiercely negotiated commodities breathed, observed, and bled. They were led to the massive stone auction blocks, not recognized as men of profound history, but as living, breathing engines of war, agriculture, and labor. The ambient noise of the market was a deafening, continuous roar of haggling voices, speaking in a dizzying cacophony of Persian, Marathi, Arabic, and the harsh, clipped tones of Portuguese. To the casual observer, the wealthy merchants, and the passing soldiers, the Africans standing bound on the wooden platforms were nothing more than silent shadows. They were perceived as defeated beings, unfortunate souls whose entire destinies were being weighed, debated, and traded for bags of silver and gold coins. But to look closer, to truly look into the eyes of the Habshis, was to see the quiet, terrifying stillness of apex predators calmly assessing a chaotic new hunting ground. The men who stepped forward to examine them, the wealthy noblemen, the ambitious warlords, and the military commanders of the eternally warring Deccan sultanates ran their calloused hands over the scarred, powerful muscles of the captives, searching only for physical perfection and brute endurance. They measured the formidable width of their shoulders, the sturdy architecture of their bones, and the raw strength of their limbs, remaining completely, tragically blind to the boundless depth and razor-sharp intellect of the minds they were so casually purchasing. It is one of the most profound and recurring tragedies of the human condition that society, especially a society built on domination, so often mistakes silence for submission and captivity for intellectual defeat. The Habshas stood on those blocks with their heads held in a subtle manner that silently defied the heavy, iron chains biting into their scarred wrists. They had been brutally stripped of their ancestral names, severed from their homelands, and violently disconnected from their rich histories, but they harbored an untouchable, fiercely guarded sovereignty within the deepest chambers of their souls. They watched the merchants argue over their worth with a detached, almost analytical coldness. They observed the bloated arrogance of the wealthy elite and the desperate, hungry eyes of the poor. They began to mentally map the intricate, fragile social hierarchies of this strange new world simply by watching the way a prospective buyer walked, the specific cadence of how he spoke to his inferiors, and the unconscious, telling way he rested his hand upon the hilt of his weapon. This market, a place entirely designed by human cruelty to completely humiliate and shatter the human spirit, inadvertently became their first, most vital academy of diplomacy and psychological warfare. They understood instantly, with the clarity of those who have lost everything, that in this fragmented, blood-soaked land, fierce loyalty was a currency far more valuable and far rarer than the purest gold. The Deccan Plateau was not a unified empire. It was a fractured, bleeding mosaic of rival kingdoms, Ahmad and Agab, Golconda constantly tearing at each other's porous borders, perpetually gripped by the suffocating paranoia of assassination and betrayal from within. The ruling sultans lived in a state of constant terror. They did not trust their own powerful nobles, their own ambitious brothers, or even the sons who stood next in line for the throne. To survive, these rulers needed absolute outsiders. They needed fiercely capable men who possessed no local ties, no deeply rooted family allegiances, and no complicated political history in the region. They desperately needed the Habshas and the captive Africans. Recognizing this glaring, desperate vulnerability in the men who claimed to be their masters, knew that the very individuals buying them as mere property were, in their arrogance, unknowingly handing them the foundational keys to the kingdom. The humiliating transactions were completed, the silver coins were exchanged, and the heavy chains were violently tugged, leading the Africans away from the bustling chaos of the market. They walked steadily into the dark, beating heart of the Indian empires, holding on to a profound secret that would soon alter the geopolitical course of the world. Their physical bodies had a price that could be paid by men, but their brilliant minds remained entirely, undeniably their own. The transformation from a traded piece of property into an elite, indispensable instrument of death is a metamorphosis forged in the darkest, most intense fires of political necessity. In the sprawling, dust-choked military camps of the Deccan sultanates, the heavy, degrading iron shackles that had bound the Habshis for months were finally struck off, only to be immediately replaced by the cold, calculated, and heavy weight of chainmail and armor. The paradox of the military slave is arguably one of history's most fascinating and dangerous ironies. In a desperate bid to protect their fragile thrones from their own treacherous, plotting relatives and local warlords, the absolute rulers of the Deccan placed the sharpest, most deadly swords into the hands of the very men they had violently torn from their homes and bought with silver. They clothed these African captives in shining iron, mounted them on the backs of the finest, swiftest Arabian warhorses, and rigorously taught them the complex art of Indian warfare in a landscape completely alien to their ancestors. The sultans operated under a fatal, arrogant delusion. They genuinely believed that by legally controlling a man's freedom and providing him with status, they could completely and forever command his absolute, unquestioning loyalty. It was a miscalculation of empire-ending proportions. As the Habshis donned the heavy armor of their masters, a profound, irreversible shift occurred in the psychological cosmos of their existence. A man holding a sharpened spear, rigorously trained in cavalry tactics, and officially tasked with defending the very life of a king, is no longer a mere laborer or a subservient captive. He instantly becomes the thin, bleeding, and immensely powerful line between a dynasty's continued survival and its absolute, violent annihilation. The vast battlefields of central India were brutal, unforgiving, and chaotic landscapes where the heavy monsoon rains routinely washed away the blood of thousands of forgotten soldiers. In the terrifying chaos of these massive clashes, the Habshi warriors fought with a breathtaking ferocity and a sophisticated tactical brilliance that terrified their enemies and utterly astounded their supposed owners. But this awe-inspiring bravery was not born of any misplaced love or devotion for the sultans, who claimed legal ownership over them. It was born of a singular, iron-forged will to survive, to rise above their station, and to violently carve out an undeniable space for themselves in a foreign world that had actively tried to erase their humanity. They bled into the dark soil of the Deccan, and with every drop of blood spilled in victory, they rooted themselves deeper and deeper into the complex political bedrock of the subcontinent. The sprawling military camps slowly evolved into their new, undeniable homelands. Here, in the harsh reality of war, merit was the only true religion that mattered. A fatal sword thrust did not care if the man wielding the weapon was born a royal prince in a palace or sold as a desperate slave in a market. Survival on the battlefield depended entirely on raw skill, unwavering brotherhood, and a ruthless, uncompromising discipline. Recognizing this, the Habshis formed incredibly tight-knit fraternities, a deeply bound brotherhood forged in the ultimate crucible of war. United by the shared trauma of their origin and the collective, ongoing reality of their exile, they moved as one, fought as one, and began to rise through the military ranks with an unstoppable, terrifying momentum. The very men who were once forced to march across continents in rusted chains were now standing on hills, commanding tens of thousands of local troops, their powerful voices echoing across the valleys, flawlessly directing the complex flow of massive, multi-city sieges and brutal open-field battles. As they continuously accumulated staggering military victories, they simultaneously began to hoard immense political capital. The ruling sultans, now utterly hopelessly dependent on their genius Habshi commanders for their very physical survival, found themselves trapped in a cycle of constantly rewarding these men with vast tracts of land, exalted noble titles, and overflowing chests of wealth to ensure their continued allegiance. The dynamic of power, once so clearly defined by the master and the slave, was slowly, invisibly, but permanently reversing. The arrogant masters were becoming entirely reliant on the men they once owned. The Habshis, who had spent their first years in India quietly observing the bloody political theater from the shadows, now boldly stepped into the blinding light of the royal courts. They meticulously learned the intricate, deadly court politics, mastering the soft whispers in the dark, marble corridors of the palaces, and perfecting the delicate, lethal art of making and instantly breaking alliances. They understood, with the clarity of true statesmen, that martial prowess on the battlefield was only half the war. The true, lasting battle was fought in the minds of men and the chambers of diplomacy. They were no longer merely the blunt swords of the empire. They were rapidly becoming the brilliant minds that directed where the strikes would land. The transition was complete. The iron of their chains had been melted down in the fires of battle and flawlessly reforged into the unbreakable steel of their resolve, perfectly preparing the stage for the imminent rise of a singular, generational genius who would unite their collective strength and make the greatest empires of the world tremble in fear. Asterisk. History rarely announces the arrival of its greatest architects with the blare of trumpets or the fanfare of royal birth. More often, the most profound transformations begin in absolute silence, gestating in the minds of those whom the world has actively tried to discard. From the collective blood-soaked crucible of the Habshi warriors in the Deccan, a singular, transcendent genius emerged, a man whose very existence would fundamentally disrupt the established order of the Asian subcontinent. He was born as Chapu in the ancient, spiritual highlands of Hara, a child of Eastern Africa whose destiny was violently hijacked by slave traders. Yet, the brutal severing from his homeland did not shatter his spirit. It distilled it. Through a series of transactional humiliations that would have broken an ordinary man, he was sold and resold across the shimmering expanse of the Indian Ocean. Eventually arriving in the fractured kingdoms of central India, his final master was a prominent Habshi nobleman, a man who recognized that the captive youth possessed an intellect that was dangerously sharp and a soul that refused to bend. Under this patronage, Chapu was educated not merely in the brutal arts of cavalry and siege warfare, but in the labyrinthine, infinitely more lethal arts of administration, diplomacy, and statecraft. He absorbed the intricate mechanics of empire building, studying how taxes flowed, how loyalties were purchased, and how the fragile architecture of power was maintained in a land constantly on the brink of collapse. When his master suddenly died, the chains of servitude legally fell away, leaving a free man standing in the chaotic heart of the Omaniga Sultanate. He took the name Malik Amber, a title that would soon echo with terror in the courts of emperors and kings. Freedom, for a man of Malik Amber's profound vision, was not an invitation to flee into obscurity. It was the ultimate, unrestricted license to conquer. While other freed mercenaries sought merely to enrich themselves through banditry or localized warlordism, Amber possessed the cold, sweeping vision of a grand master looking at a chessboard where all the pieces were perfectly aligned for a revolution. He understood a fundamental, terrifying truth about human nature and political power. The men who sit on thrones are rarely the ones who truly rule. Kings are bound by the heavy, visible chains of tradition, public expectation, and the constant, paralyzing paranoia of assassination. True power, absolute and unyielding power, resides in the shadows, in the hands of the one who controls the military, manages the treasury, and dictates the alliances without ever wearing the suffocating weight of the crown. With breathtaking audacity, Malik Amber began to gather his own independent army, recruiting not only his fellow Habshi brethren but also thousands of local Maratha warriors, fierce, lightly armed cavalrymen who intimately knew every hidden ravine and treacherous mountain pass of the Deccan Plateau. He molded this disparate group of outcasts and localized fighters into a fiercely loyal, terrifyingly efficient war machine. When the internal politics of the Ahmadnagar Sultanate inevitably descended into a bloody, chaotic vacuum of succession, Amber did not foolishly reach for the throne himself. Such a move would have united the racist, class-obsessed nobility against him. Instead, he reached into the royal dungeons, found a forgotten, imprisoned prince of the ruling dynasty, and flawlessly orchestrated his coronation. By placing the royal crown upon the head of a puppet, Malik Amber officially became the supreme regent, the undisputed prime minister, and the absolute commander of the realm. He was no longer a piece to be moved, traded, or discarded. He had officially become the player, the undisputed kingmaker, holding the fate of millions in the scarred palms of his hands. The ascension of Malik Amber occurred not in a vacuum of peace, but under the terrifying, rapidly expanding shadow of the greatest geopolitical leviathan the world had ever seen. To the north, beyond the winding rivers and the dense, humid forests, the Mughal Empire was awake, and it was devastatingly hungry. Founded by descendants of Genghis Khan and Timur, the Mughal war machine was a staggering spectacle of absolute, centralized authority and overwhelming military supremacy. Under the command of the legendary Emperor Akbar, the Mughals had methodically swallowed the kingdoms of northern India, drowning resistance in a sea of heavily armored elephants, massive, earth-shattering siege cannons, and hundreds of thousands of elite cavalry. The wealth of the Mughal court was legendary. Their architecture defied imagination, and their ambition recognized no earthly boundaries. For the emperors sitting upon the glittering peacock throne in Agra, the independent sultanates of the Deccan Plateau were an intolerable insult, a fragmented, chaotic frontier that defied their divine right to rule the entire subcontinent from the Himalayas to the southern oceans. The Deccan was the ultimate prize, the missing jewel in the imperial crown, and the Mughals viewed its conquest not as a possibility, but as a preordained, absolute certainty. As the northern horizon began to darken with the suffocating dust kicked up by the vanguard of the encroaching Mughal armies, a profound sense of existential dread washed over the kingdoms of central India. The sheer scale of the approaching force was designed to shatter the psychological will of the enemy long before the first arrow was ever fired. Spies and merchants brought back terrifying whispers of military camps that stretched further than the eye could see, of cannons so massive they required hundreds of oxen to move, and of generals who had never tasted the bitter ash of defeat. The traditional rulers of the Deccan, paralyzed by a combination of decadent complacency and sheer, overwhelming terror, fractured under the pressure. Some immediately sent envoys carrying humiliating treaties of total submission, desperately offering their daughters in marriage and their treasuries in tribute to spare their own lives. Others locked themselves behind the massive stone walls of their ancient forts, praying to silent gods that the storm would somehow pass them by. They prepared to fight the Mughals using the traditional, rigid doctrines of pitched battles and honorable combat, a suicidal strategy against an enemy that possessed infinite resources and inexhaustible manpower. But Malik Amber stood on the high ridges of the Sahyadri Mountains, looking northward into the eye of the gathering storm, and he did not succumb to the paralyzing panic of the native kings. He possessed a mind unburdened by the fatal, romanticized illusions of honorable warfare that plagued the Indian nobility. He knew, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that to meet the overwhelming might of the Mughal Empire in an open, traditional battlefield was to invite complete and immediate annihilation. The vast, heavy Mughal cavalry would crush his forces in hours. Their massive cannons would turn the stone walls of his fortresses into crumbling tombs. Therefore, he reasoned, he must completely rewrite the very rules of the war. If the Mughals were an unstoppable, crashing ocean of iron and fire, He would become the sharp, unyielding rocks upon which that ocean would slowly, agonizingly bleed itself to death. He began to look at the harsh, unforgiving geography of the Deccan not merely as the land he lived on, but as the ultimate, most devastating weapon in his arsenal. The deep valleys, the blinding monsoon rains, the suffocating heat, and the impenetrable forests were about to be weaponized by a brilliant African mind, preparing a trap so vast, so incredibly complex, and so deeply psychological that the greatest empire in the world would walk willingly into its own slow, humiliating destruction. The coastline of the Indian subcontinent has always been a porous threshold, a space where the infinite expanse of the ocean breathes against the ancient sun-baked earth. For centuries, the Arabian Sea was a fluid highway of cultural exchange, carrying the dhows of Arab merchants, the ships of African traders, and the vessels of Indian kingdoms in a delicate, rhythmic harmony dictated by the monsoon winds. But a new, terrifying silhouette began to tear through the morning mist, casting long, dark shadows upon the coastal waters. These were not the familiar, elegant sails of the regional merchants. They were the massive, lumbering galleons of the Portuguese Empire, floating fortresses of timber and iron driven by an insatiable hunger for a global monopoly. The men who commanded these alien ships brought with them a profound arrogance, viewing the vast, interconnected world of the Indian Ocean not as a shared ecosystem of commerce, but as a divine right granted to them by distant European monarchs and papal decrees. They anchored their intimidating fleets off the ports of the Deccan, their heavy bronze cannons aimed directly at the heart of the ancient trade routes. The Portuguese did not come to integrate, they came to dominate, to violently sever the vital arteries of the spice trade and bleed the wealth of the East directly into the treasuries of Lisbon. They constructed formidable stone fortresses along the coastline, their sheer walls rising from the sea like monuments to their uncompromising greed, forever altering the geopolitical landscape of the subcontinent for the rulers of the Deccan. Already suffocating under the immense, crushing weight of the impending Mughal invasion from the north, the arrival of this terrifying naval power from the west felt like the final, definitive stroke of doom. They found themselves trapped in a terrifying vice, caught between a monolithic land empire that sought to devour their territories and a ruthless maritime empire that sought to strangle their economy. Yet, where the native kings saw only absolute despair and inevitable ruin, the mind of Malik Amber perceived a completely different reality. He stood on the high parapets of his coastal strongholds, his gaze moving past the terrifying muzzles of the Portuguese cannons, looking deep into the fundamental vulnerabilities of these European conquerors. He recognized that their terrifying naval supremacy was a fragile illusion when disconnected from the land. The Portuguese possessed devastating firepower on the water, but they were vastly outnumbered, utterly alienated from the local populations, and completely dependent on the very mainland they sought to exploit for their daily survival. They were a maritime predator that could not survive a prolonged struggle in the deep, treacherous jungles and mountains of the interior. Amber understood that the Portuguese were not invincible gods of the sea. They were merely men driven by a profound, blinding paranoia. They were terrified of the encroaching Mughal Empire, knowing with absolute certainty that if the colossal armies of the north ever reached the western coast, their fragile, lucrative monopoly over the ports would be instantly and violently annihilated. This brilliant, terrifying realization became the absolute foundation of an unprecedented diplomatic master. The grand chessboard of the Deccan was now fully set, and the pieces were in motion. On one side stood the Mughal emperor, a man whose vast armies could darken the horizon, driven by an obsessive need to bring the entire world under his absolute dominion. On the other side stood the Portuguese viceroys, men who controlled the oceans with terrifying brutality but lived in constant fear of losing their precarious foothold on the continent, and perfectly positioned in the chaotic, bleeding center of this geopolitical storm was a man who had once been sold for a handful of silver coins. Malik Amber did not merely survive this impossible situation, he orchestrated it. He began a magnificent, lethal dance of diplomacy, weaving a web of manipulation so intricate and so profoundly deceptive that both empires fundamentally believed they were using him, while in reality, they were merely dancing to the rhythm he dictated. He reached out to the Portuguese, not as a desperate, terrified king begging for salvation, but as an indispensable equal holding the very keys to their continued survival. He whispered to the European commanders, painting terrifying, vivid pictures of the Mughal cavalry sweeping down from the mountains to burn their coastal forts to the ashes. He convinced them that his Habshi and Maratha armies were the only physical barrier preventing their total destruction. In exchange for acting as their shield against the north, he demanded their heavy artillery, their finest gunpowder, and their absolute naval protection for his own supply lines. Simultaneously, with breathtaking audacity, he turned his face to the north and played the same lethal game with the Mughal commanders. He manipulated the sheer scale of the Mughal ambition, creating deliberate, agonizing friction between their various generals. He used the terrifying presence of the Portuguese fleets as a diplomatic weapon against the Mughals, subtly suggesting that if pushed to the absolute brink, he would grant the Europeans full, unrestricted access to the deepest interior of the Deccan, a scenario that would permanently paralyze the Mughal expansion. He transformed the very geography of the Deccan into a psychological torture chamber for his enemies. He would forge a temporary, seemingly unbreakable alliance with the Portuguese to brutally repel a massive Mughal offensive, utilizing European cannons manned by African and Indian artillerymen to shatter the northern cavalry. Then, the moment the Portuguese began to demand more territory or greater control over the ports in return for their assistance, Amber would instantly, flawlessly pivot. He would deliberately allow small, controlled contingents of Mughal forces to advance just close enough to the coast to send the European commanders into a blind, terrifying panic, forcing them to instantly drop their arrogant demands and beg for his protection once again. The kings in Lisbon and Madrid, reading the frustrated, desperate dispatches from their viceroys in India, were completely bewildered. They could not comprehend how their invincible armadas and their finest military minds were being continuously outmaneuvered, blackmailed, and fundamentally controlled by an African former slave in a land they believed they had rightfully conquered. The great Mughal Emperor Jahangir, sitting amidst the unimaginable wealth of his northern palaces, would throw fits of absolute, uncontrollable rage, his finest generals returning in disgrace, their massive armies bled dry by a man who refused to fight them on their own terms. Malik Amber had successfully turned the two greatest military machines of the age against each other, using the blinding arrogance of the Mughals and the desperate greed of the Portuguese as the very instruments of their own mutual destruction. He was no longer just defending a fractured kingdom. He was actively, brilliantly dictating the geopolitical destiny of the entire known world, leaving emperors and kings grasping at the empty air, completely paralyzed by the profound genius of a mind they had once arrogantly dismissed as property. Power, in its most terrifying and absolute form, is rarely a sword swung in broad daylight. Rather, it is the quiet, deliberate whisper planted in the ear of a king who believes he is entirely alone in the dark. The grand chessboard of the Deccan was merely the physical, blood-soaked manifestation of a much deeper, infinitely more complex psychological war that Malik Amber waged across vast continents, across unforgiving oceans, and across the heavily guarded, marble thresholds of imperial courts. He understood a fundamental, paralyzing truth about the nature of global empires. The men who wore the heavily jeweled crowns in Lisbon, Madrid, and Agra were entirely, hopelessly isolated by their own unimaginable elevation. They were fed fragmented pieces of information by desperate viceroys, ambitious, treacherous generals, and terrified merchants, all of whom meticulously filtered the harsh truth through the distorted lens of their own fragile survival and insatiable greed. Amber confidently stepped into this vast, chaotic void of truth and became the invisible, omnipotent architect of their deepest political paranoia. He did not need to construct vast armadas to cross the sea and lay siege to European capitals. He simply needed to control the fragile, desperate narratives that sailed upon those waters. He established an intricate, labyrinthian network of silent spies, multilingual double agents, and incredibly wealthy maritime merchants who carried his carefully constructed, utterly deceptive realities directly into the administrative hearts of the enemy empires. The letters meticulously drafted and dispatched by the Portuguese viceroys stationed in the humid, heavily fortified enclaves of Goa back to their distant sovereign in the Iberian Peninsula were masterpieces of profound, agonizing administrative confusion. They wrote page after page of desperate ink, speaking of an African commander who was simultaneously their greatest, most vital military protector and their most terrifying, unpredictable existential threat. They tried to explain to a king sitting in a cold stone palace in Europe how a man who was once bought and sold as mere property could now effortlessly summon tens of thousands of fierce Maratha cavalrymen from the very dust of the earth, only to dissolve them back into the impenetrable mountains before a single, heavy Portuguese cannon could even be aimed. The European monarchs, entirely accustomed to straightforward, heavily formalized wars of conquest, clear unbroken lines of feudal loyalty, and enemies who adhered to the rigid, predictable doctrines of aristocratic warfare, found their minds completely paralyzed by an adversary who absolutely refused to exist within their narrow ethnocentric paradigms. They could not comprehend a foe who traded in shadows and shifting alliances, rather than pitched battles and formal treaties. Consequently, the royal courts of Europe sent increasingly frantic, deeply contradictory orders across the treacherous expanse of the ocean. The monarchs demanded that their viceroys either assassinate this Habshi warlord immediately, employing any dark means necessary, or bow completely to his every shifting demand in order to secure the vital, immensely lucrative spice trade that funded their global ambitions. Amber had essentially reached across the vast, dark expanse of the Indian Ocean and wrapped his invisible, battle-scarred fingers tightly around the heavy gold crowns of Europe, making the most powerful monarchs on earth dance to a terrifying, silent rhythm they could neither hear nor truly comprehend. He weaponized their immense geographic distance, turning their unprecedented global reach into a blinding, suffocating liability. Every battered galleon that arrived in the ports of Lisbon carrying diminished, disappointing profits and desperate, weeping pleas for immediate military reinforcements, was a monumental testament to the absolute sovereignty of a man who had once been violently stripped of his own humanity. He proved, with devastating, terrifying elegance, that a brilliant mind firmly anchored in the rugged, sun-baked hills of the Deccan could effectively and absolutely rule the foreign policy of empires, located thousands of miles away, simply by manipulating the desperate. Whispers that eventually reached the velvet steps of the throne. Chapter 10. The Emperor's Obsession. The profound geopolitical confusion of the European kings paled in absolute comparison to the all-consuming, violently destructive fury that burned continuously within the heart of the great Mughal Emperor Jahangir. To truly understand the psychological torture inflicted upon Jahangir is to understand the mind of a man who had been raised to believe himself the literal, divine shadow of God upon the earth, an absolute sovereign whose very breath was meant to command the immediate, unquestioning obedience of millions. He possessed material wealth that violently defied mortal comprehension, ruling from sprawling, labyrinthine palaces of pure white marble adorned with oceans of precious gems, commanding military forces so incredibly vast they routinely drank entire rivers dry on their relentless marches of conquest. And yet, all of this unimaginable, godlike power, all of this infinite wealth, was continuously, humiliatingly rendered entirely impotent by a single, aging African former slave commanding a fractured rebellion in the southern mountains. Jahangir's official, imperial memoirs. The beautifully penned Tusakai Jahanjari are filled with unprecedented, venomous vitriol directed solely at Malik Amba. The emperor completely abandoned the dignified, detached prose of a divine ruler, instead referring to the Habshi genius with desperate, hateful epithets, repeatedly calling him the black-faced, the ill-starred, the crafty, and the rebel of dark fortune. This profound, unhinged hatred was not merely born of traditional military frustration. It was an absolute, existential terror. Amba represented the terrifying invalidation of the Mughal divine right to rule. The Mughal state was essentially a massive, insatiable machine built entirely on the perpetual promise of endless expansion. When that expansion was halted, the machine threatened to consume itself. Every single time a massive, heavily armored Mughal army was sent south into the Deccan, commanded by decorated royal princes and legendary, battle-hardened generals, it was meticulously dismantled, starved of vital resources, and bled into the merciless dust by Amba's invisible, ghost-like forces. The emperor's obsession slowly mutated into a suffocating, the blinding sickness that infected the entirety of the Mughal court. The most powerful man in the known world found his every waking thought entirely consumed by a man he could not catch, could not buy with all the gold in India, and could not kill with the greatest army on earth. The psychological devastation eventually reached such an unprecedented, profoundly surreal climax that Jahan, utterly unable to achieve victory in the harsh, physical realm of the Deccan, commissioned his absolute mastercourt artists to paint a grand, desperate, and ultimately pathetic fantasy. He had himself depicted in a breathtakingly detailed miniature painting, standing victoriously upon the globe of the earth, holding a magnificent, gilded bow, shooting a fatal arrow directly through the severed, impaled head of Malik Ambar. It remains one of the most profound, deeply tragic artifacts in the history of human conflict. A supreme emperor, commanding the greatest, most terrifying military machine on the planet, forced to seek solace and comfort in a painted, imaginary vengeance because his actual reality was entirely, hopelessly dominated by the supreme, undeniable genius of his enemy. The painting was originally intended to be a spectacular display of ultimate divine power for the royal court, but it stands eternally as a monumental, undeniable testament to Malik Ambar's absolute psychological victory. Emperor Jahangir spent his days shooting imaginary arrows at a painted ghost, completely unable to accept the terrifying, undeniable truth that the Habshi visionary had already built an impenetrable fortress within the emperor's own mind, a fortress that no massive Mughal cannon could ever hope to breach. Ambar had successfully turned the supreme, glittering majesty of the Mughal court into a dark, suffocating prison of obsessive impotence, proving to the course of history that true, lasting conquest is not the violent subjugation of the physical body, but the total, inescapable occupation of the enemy's soul. Ghosts of the Sayadrith earth itself possesses a profound, ancient memory, a silent but absolute resistance against the blinding arrogance of men who seek to bind it with the heavy, rusted chains of empire. The Sayadri Mountains, a jagged, unforgiving spine of dark basalt and dense, suffocating forest running along the western edge of the Indian plateau, were not merely a geographical feature to be conquered. In the brilliant, calculating mind of Malik Ambar, this treacherous landscape was the absolute, defining protagonist in a magnificent symphony of imperial destruction. He understood a fundamental law of nature that the arrogant emperors of the north had entirely forgotten. The larger and more heavily armored the beast, the more desperately it requires sustenance, and the more violently it collapses under its own immense weight. The Mughals arrived at the foothills of the Deccan with their immense, lumbering columns of annihilation. Their towering war elephants, draped in heavy iron and shimmering gold, were specifically designed to shatter the massive wooden gates of ancient stone fortresses, Their gigantic bronze cannons, symbols of their absolute, unquestioned technological supremacy, required the strained, bleeding muscles of hundreds of oxen simply to be dragged across the unforgiving dusty plains. The Mughal commanders, decorated in the finest silks and burdened by generations of unbroken military pride, expected a formalized, honorable slaughter. They fully expected the Habshi upstart to array his forces on an open, sun-baked field, to engage in the predictable, rigid mathematics of imperial combat where the larger, wealthier army invariably devours the smaller. But Malik Amber had fundamentally and completely transcended the fragile, destructive ego of traditional kingship. He knew, with the terrifying clarity of a man who had survived the absolute bottom of the human hierarchy, that honor on a traditional battlefield is a deadly luxury paid for entirely with the lives of the foolish. He introduced the vast Mughal war machine to a terrifying, formless nightmare known as Barjagiri, a revolutionary, ruthlessly pragmatic system of highly mobile guerrilla warfare that would forever change the military history of the subcontinent. He deliberately stripped his tens of thousands of Maratha cavalrymen of all heavy, burdensome armor that would slow their ascent into the hills. He armed them instead with light, deadly lances, curved steel swords, and the intimate ancestral knowledge of every single hidden ravine, every treacherous mountain pass, and every dry, seasonal riverbed. When the massive Mughal army marched into the deep valleys, Amber did not attack their heavily armored vanguard. Instead, he simply allowed them to walk into the vast, green jaws of the mountains, and then he methodically, ruthlessly closed the teeth. His light cavalry became literal ghosts. They struck with the sudden, terrifying violence of a lightning bolt in the dead of the night, setting fire to the massive, sprawling Mughal supply tents, slaughtering the vital baggage trains, and poisoning the ancient water wells, only to instantly dissolve back into the impenetrable blackness of the forest before a single heavy Mughal cannon could even be rotated to aim. The imperial army, entirely cut off from their distant supply lines in the north, began to slowly, agonizingly starve amidst the lush, mocking greenery of the Deccan. The invincible Mughal cavalrymen, accustomed to the glorious, sweeping charges of the northern plains, who found themselves hopelessly trapped in narrow, muddy defiles, their magnificent, expansive Arabian horses breaking their legs on the treacherous basalt rocks. The immense psychological toll was absolutely devastating. The Mughal soldiers were not fighting an army, they were fighting the very shadows, fighting the biting insects, the blinding monsoon rains, and the terrifying, continuous realization that they were slowly bleeding to death in a foreign land without ever seeing the face of the man who was killing them. Amber had brilliantly transformed the staggering, unprecedented size and wealth of the Mughal Empire into its most fatal, insurmountable weakness. The puppeteer's strength, the physical, blood-soaked battlefield of the Sahyadri Mountains was a masterpiece of violent, geographical attrition. The grand diplomatic theater orchestrated by Malik Amber was a terrifying, unparalleled display of absolute psychological subjugation. He had successfully, miraculously transformed his own profound, terrifying vulnerability, being an isolated, former African slave entirely surrounded by the world's most aggressive global superpowers, into the very undeniable instrument of his total invincibility. He became the undisputed, omnipotent master of a complex geopolitical ecosystem where the absolute physical survival of his bitterest enemies depended entirely, tragically, upon his continued existence. This is the profound, terrifying paradox of the ultimate puppeteer. The intricate strings that control the wooden figures are kept entirely invisible, allowing the puppets to genuinely, foolishly believe they are dancing to the rhythm of their own free will, right up until the moment they are directed to walk off the edge of the stage. The great Mughal and Portuguese empires, despite their unimaginable material wealth and their terrifying military might, were essentially blinded by their own colossal, suffocating arrogance. The Portuguese viceroys, terrified of the encroaching northern armies, willingly and desperately supplied Amber with their finest, state-of-the-art European artillery, their most volatile gunpowder, and heavily armed naval escorts for his coastal supply lines. They genuinely believed they were shrewdly purchasing a compliant, violent mercenary to act as an impenetrable buffer state. Simultaneously, Amber maintained a dark, treacherous network of secret correspondence with the rival sultans of the Deccan and the deeply frustrated, exhausted Mughal generals. He played upon their deep-seated generational jealousies, their paralyzing paranoia, and their insatiable, blinding greed. He would deliberately feign absolute weakness, allowing the Mughal forces to push dangerously close to the Portuguese coastal forts, instantly triggering a blind, existential panic in Goa that resulted in massive, immediate shipments of European gold and weapons directly into his own hidden treasuries. The absolute, devastating climax of this brilliant, multi-layered manipulation culminated in the legendary mud-soaked Battle of Bhatwadi. The frustrated Mughal emperor, having forged a massive, seemingly unstoppable alliance with the rival Adil Shahi Sultanate of Bijapur, to send a combined, overwhelming imperial force to finally, permanently crush the Habshi rebellion. They marched into the Deccan with a confidence born of absolute numerical supremacy. But Amber did not merely wait for them. He meticulously engineered their tomb. He strategically retreated, drawing the massive, heavily armored combined armies deep into a low-lying, completely enclosed valley, a space he had chosen years in advance. He allowed them to set up their magnificent, sprawling camps, lulling them into a false, fatal sense of security. And then, under the cover of a torrential, blinding night rain, Amber gave the quiet, devastating order to his engineers. They violently breached the massive earthen dams of the nearby lakes, weaponizing the very water of the earth itself. Millions of gallons of dark, rushing water flooded the valley, instantly turning the campsite into a terrifying, suffocating ocean of deep, inescapable mud. The massive, golden Mughal cannons sank completely beneath the earth. The heavily armored elite cavalrymen were completely immobilized, trapped in the freezing sludge, their magnificent weapons rendered entirely useless. As the morning sun rose over the devastation, Amber's light, unburdened forces descended from the high ridges, not to fight a battle but to conduct a methodical, entirely unchallenged execution. The greatest generals of the age, men who had conquered entire continents, were forced to surrender their deeply humiliated forces to an African visionary who had defeated them, without even requiring his men to draw their swords. The puppeteer had brilliantly pulled the final fatal string, forcing two massive empires to violently drown themselves in the very mud they had sought to conquer, forever cementing his legacy not merely as a brilliant warrior, but as the absolute, undisputed architect of their ultimate humiliation. The ocean that once served as the vast, terrifying highway of their enslavement was destined to become the ultimate theater of their absolute sovereignty. To look upon the churning, dark waters of the Arabian Sea was for the Habshas to gaze into the cold, unforgiving abyss of their own traumatic genesis. It was the water that had carried the heavy wooden ships of their captors, the water that had swallowed the tears and the bodies of those who did not survive the Middle Passage from the Horn of Africa to the shores of India. Yet, in the profound, poetic justice that only the deepest currents of history can orchestrate, Malik Amber and his descendants looked upon those very waves not with lingering terror, but with the cold, calculating eyes of supreme conquerors. They recognized that true, unbreakable independence could never be fully secured as long as the maritime borders of the Deccan remained vulnerable to the colossal galleons of the European empires. The Portuguese, despite being repeatedly humiliated on land, still believed the sea was their divine, unchallenged domain. Amber set out to shatter this final arrogant illusion, transforming the descendants of enslaved Africans into the undisputed lords of the Indian Ocean. They did not merely build ships, they engineered impregnable, floating mountains of basalt and iron that violently defied the very wrath of the sea. Out of the violent coastal tides rose the legendary sea fortresses, the most magnificent of them being Janjira, an architectural marvel of military genius that would remain undefeated for centuries. They constructed massive, curved stone walls that rose directly out of the crashing waves, completely eliminating any shoreline or beachhead where an invading European navy could possibly land their heavily armored troops. They mounted massive long-range bronze cannons, cast with unprecedented metallurgical skill, perfectly positioned to unleash a devastating, inescapable crossfire upon any foreign armada foolish enough to enter their coastal waters. The construction of these maritime citadels was not merely a physical defense mechanism. It was a profound, monumental declaration of absolute psychological triumph. The very men who were once bound in rusted iron chains in the suffocating bellies of foreign ships were now standing upon the high, sun-baked parapets of their own island fortresses, commanding independent naval fleets that dictated the terms of global maritime trade. The European maritime empires, entirely accustomed to violently dictating the laws of commerce through the sheer terror of their naval artillery, found themselves paralyzed by a terrifying new reality. The Habshi admirals, intimately understanding the shifting monsoon winds and the treacherous hidden reefs of the coastline, launched devastating, highly coordinated naval strikes against the Portuguese supply lines. They would wait for the heavy European galleons to become sluggish in the shallow waters, and then their swift, heavily armed coastal vessels would strike with the venomous precision of a viper, boarding the ships, capturing the unimaginable wealth of the spice trade, and vanishing back into the protective, cannon-covered embrace of their island fortresses. The Portuguese viceroys, weeping in their heavily fortified enclaves, were forced to sign deeply humiliating treaties, paying vast sums of protective tribute to the African commanders simply for the right to safely navigate the waters they had arrogantly claimed as their own. Amber had flawlessly closed the geopolitical circle. He had locked the massive Mughal armies behind the impenetrable bleeding wall of the Sahyadri Mountains, and he had permanently chained the magnificent European armadas to the unforgiving rocks of the coast, ruling the absolute center with an unmatched, terrifying brilliance. Time, however, is the only sovereign that absolutely no earthly monarch can bribe, outmaneuver, or defeat. It eventually arrived to claim the supreme architect of the Deccan, but it did so entirely on his own terms. Malik Amber did not fall violently upon a blood-soaked battlefield, struck down by the heavy swords of his countless enemies. He was not poisoned in the dark, marble corridors of a treacherous palace, Nor was he betrayed by the fiercely loyal men he had elevated from the dust. He had survived assassination attempts, massive imperial invasions, and the suffocating pressure of ruling a fractured kingdom, living to an extraordinarily advanced age that defied the brutal, short-lived mathematics of his era. When his breath finally faded into the humid air of the Deccan Plateau in 1626, he passed away peacefully, surrounded by an invincible army of his own creation, leaving behind a completely secure, prosperous kingdom that stood as a monumental testament to his unparalleled genius. The news of his death rippled outward from the mountains, carrying a profound, earth-shattering shockwave across the subcontinent and over the oceans. In the glittering, unimaginably wealthy courts of the north, the reaction was a complex, deeply agonizing mixture of profound relief and absolute, undeniable awe. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir, the man who had spent the entirety of his supreme reign obsessively painting imaginary victories over the Habshi visionary, was finally forced to confront the devastating, unvarnished truth in his imperial memoirs. The emperor, abandoning his usual venomous epithets, recorded the death of his greatest enemy with a somber, uncharacteristic reverence, writing that history had never recorded an equal to him in the complex arts of warfare, profound administrative intellect, and sheer, unbreakable military command. It was the ultimate, inescapable surrender. The greatest empire in the world was forced to bow its heavy, jeweled head in quiet respect to the memory of an African child sold into bondage. The sunset of Malik Amber's life was not an end, but the permanent cementing of a legendary immortality. He closed his eyes knowing that he had completely, fundamentally altered the destiny of millions. He had found a land fractured by fear and ruled by the arrogant, and he left it fortified by steel, ruled by the fiercely capable and absolutely untethered from the violent whims of foreign kings. He had proven to the silent, watching eyes of history that the human spirit, even when subjected to the most horrific, dehumanizing depths of the global slave trade, possesses an absolute, terrifying capacity to rise, to learn the deadly mechanics of its oppressors, and to completely, flawlessly rewrite the architecture of the world. His physical body was returned to the dark earth of India, housed in a magnificent, quiet mausoleum, but his immense, unbreakable shadow would continue to stretch across the mountains and the oceans for generations to come. History is not a silent graveyard of dates and fallen empires. It is a living, breathing acoustic chamber where the echoes of absolute greatness continue to resonate long after the physical bodies of the architects have returned to the dust. The great Mughal Empire, which once arrogantly claimed dominion over the entire earth, eventually suffocated under the immense, decadent weight of its own insatiable greed, its magnificent peacock thrones plundered, its royal lineage descending into bloody, fratricidal chaos. The Portuguese maritime empire, which once terrified the oceans with its floating fortresses, slowly rotted away into historical insignificance, its heavily armed galleons replaced by other, equally transient colonial phantoms. Yet, the profound, undeniable lineage of the Habshi, the African captives who violently severed the strings of their own subjugation to become the supreme puppet masters of the Indian subcontinent, remains permanently, beautifully woven into the very geological and cultural bedrock of the land they conquered. To look upon the harsh, sun-baked landscape of the Deccan Plateau today is to realize that the ghost of Malik Amber still commands the horizon with an absolute, benevolent authority, while traditional, insecure conquerors obsessed over building massive, gaudy tombs and towering monuments dedicated entirely to their own inflated egos. The Habshi visionary understood that true, immortal legacy is forged by sustaining the lives of the people, recognizing that the arid, unforgiving plains of his capital city, Khadki, which the Mughals later arrogantly renamed Aurangabad, suffered from chronic, devastating water shortages. He did not merely order the digging of shallow wells. Instead, he channeled his profound, unparalleled administrative genius into the earth itself. He engineered the Nahari Ambari, an astonishingly complex, the subterranean network of aqueducts that captured the pure water from the surrounding mountains and distributed it flawlessly throughout the city using nothing but the sheer mathematical perfection of gravity. Long after the swords of his enemies had rusted into oblivion, this brilliant hydraulic circulatory system continued to bring life to the parched earth, standing as a monumental, a flowing testament to a mind that was as deeply committed to the nurturing of his citizens as it was to the violent destruction of his adversaries. But the true, beating heart of this epic narrative is not confined to the cold, silent stones of ancient aqueducts or the crumbling parapets of impenetrable sea forts. The most profound echo of the Habshi resonates within the living, breathing descendants of these African visionaries, a fiercely resilient community known today as the Siddha, scattered across the dense, humid forests of Karnataka, the bustling, ancient streets of Hyderabad, and the coastal villages of Gujarat. The cities are the living, breathing inheritors of a history that absolutely refuses to be erased.